Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Duma Gqubule. I'm from the Worldwide Institute of Leadership and Development. We are very passionate and compassionate about leadership empowerment, about leadership development, because we have realized that if we can fix leadership, everything will improve in our society, in our countries, in our nations, in our institutions, in our families, everywhere, because leadership is everything and everything is leadership. That is why we meet here every Wednesdays at 6 p.m. As leaders, as scholars from all over the world, just to discuss leadership. Now we are here, as I've said, and we are looking forward to see you again next week and again the other week and every week as much as you can. We are addressing a very important topic today, and I'm about to introduce our speaker, because it's a Zoom session, so we don't have time to talk a lot. We just get straight to the point. And also because we are leaders, we are professionals. So straight to the point, and we just discuss. So for the sake of those who are joining us for the first time, I'll introduce our speaker. He will address us, and then we'll engage him and engage each other once he has addressed us. Tonight we are discussing Vision 2035, a plan to achieve full, I like the word full, full, I mean, full in English, it means full. So we must just take it like this, that a plan to achieve full employment in South Africa about this, or if we can follow this Vision 2035 that we are going to hear shortly from my brother. So we are talking about Duma Gqubule. Most of you know him, especially those who are here from South Africa, but I know that we are joined by colleagues from all over the world, as I've said. Others are joining us from other countries. But just very briefly, Duma Gqubule has spent more than 2 decades as a financial journalist, analyst, researcher, and advisor on issues of economic development and transformation. He was educated at Waterford Kamhlaba School, that is in Eswatini, and also in Aberdeen University in Scotland, where he studied economics. He first worked as a financial journalist for most of the country's leading publications. His work was recognized, and he later worked for the Black Economic Empowerment Commission, as you know it, which was chaired by the current president, Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa. He was co-author of the Commission's landmark report in 2002, which paved the way for the current Black economic empowerment laws and policies. He was editor of the book, Making Mistakes, Righting Wrongs, Insight into Black Economic Empowerment, which reviewed the country's economic transformation policies during the first decade of democracy. In 2022, the BE Commission gave him a Spearhead Award for his work in this era. I remember very well during those times at Duma, during those years. I think I was working for Busa at that time. He worked for numerous organizations in the public and private sector, including the NEPAD Secretariat, where he was one of the experts who drafted the indicators for the African peer review mechanism. He has done research on the transformation of the mining sector and international best practices on the governance of the sector, and written a chapter in a mystery book, The Future what is it called? Where is it now? Sorry, yeah, is the future of mining in South Africa, sunset or sunrise? A heterodox economist, I like that word, and I like that. He calls himself a heterodox. I think I must call myself a heterodox leader. A heterodox economist. He is part of civil society campaigns for universal basic income and a job guarantee and a transformation activist. He is a research associate at the Social Policy Initiative and does research on youth unemployment for youth capital. He is a Business Day columnist, public speaker, and a commentator on issues related to economic development and transformation. Ladies and gentlemen, that is my brother, Duma Gqubule. And welcome, my brother. Thank you so much once again for availing yourself. The stage is yours now. You can address us. And then once you've done it, the colleagues will engage you with questions and answers. Over to you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. So can you see the presentation? Yeah. Okay, great. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for taking time to listen to me. Some of you are having supper today at this moment, and you sacrifice spending time with your family to listen to this presentation. So basically, I just want to say that, I've become very impatient about the lack of progress in terms of our economy. And I think it's completely unacceptable. And I just want to talk about, I just want to do a presentation about my view on the issues of the economy. So, we've had 30 wasted years under ANC rule. It's a painful thing for me to say because I grew up in an ANC family. We started off in the Black consciousness movement, my family, and later on, they joined the ANC. But quite frankly, it's been a painful disappointment in terms of the management of the economy. Our GDP per capita grew by about 22% from 1994 to 2023. By comparison in local currencies, China grew by 779%, Rwanda by 422%, Vietnam by 354%, India by 282%, Ethiopia by 278%. Ethiopia is quite interesting. It grew throughout the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, growing at record growth. It grew through the COVID pandemic, and it grew through the situation, the civil war in Tigray recently. It's a story of about two halves. GDP grew by 3.6% a year from 1994 to 2008, two 15-year periods. And then it collapsed to 1.2% a year from 2009 to 2023. Now, politicians like to blame international factors, so I have to keep on harping on this issue. Over the same period when we collapsed to 1.2% growth, emerging and developing countries grew by 4.4% a year, and emerging and developing Asia grew by 6.3% a year. Now, if you look at it by political administration, we had 2.7% growth under Nelson Mandela, 4% under Thabo Mbeki, 1.9% under Jacob Zuma, and 0.5% under Cyril Ramaphosa. Objectively, this administration, the sixth administration under Cyril Ramaphosa, is the worst we've had since 1994. But so now what is, I try to summarize the situation in this slide as to basically the economy grows and creates jobs when government invests in its people and in its infrastructure, and it stops growing and creating jobs when the government doesn't invest in its infrastructure. So in 1996, we had a policy called GEAR, which sought to reduce public debt and reduce inflation. But the thing I don't understand is that if you look at all the data in 1996, there was no apartheid debt crisis. That is ANC propaganda. There was no foreign debt crisis. The foreign debt was about 1.9% of GDP, which is extremely low by any international standard. We had government consumption spending during the GEAR period from 1996 to 2002 increased by about 2% a year, 2.1% a year. And there was a first public sector investment strike where public investment collapsed by 25% from 1998 to 2001. And it returned to 1998 levels only in 2004. Our average nominal interest rate was 17.7%. This was during the first wave of Black economic empowerment. It is insane to even consider how it is possible for any company, BE company, to make money with such ludicrously insane high interest rates. There is no justification whatsoever for an annual interest rate of about 18%. GDP growth, 2.9%, per capita growth, 0.6%. But the ultimate bottom line of any country is employment. Unemployment soared to 8 million people, 40.6% in Q1 2003, from 4.6 million in 1996, 33%. Now, when the government stopped here and it started spending on its people and its infrastructure, the country grew again. Government consumption spending was 5% a year. There was an public sector investment boom. It increased by 14% a year, and it doubled during that period. The average interest rate came down to 12.7%, and our economy grew at 4.5% a year. GDP per capita grew by 3.2%, and we created 3.1 million jobs. Unemployment declined to 5.9%, and the unemployment rate came down to 28.7%. Now, the last period, this is the critical period in our history, 2009 to 2023. Government final consumption spending, 1.6% a year, lower than during the GEAR period. And then we had the second post-apartheid investment strike, where investment declined by 24%. I can't understand the logic of not investing in infrastructure, because every research shows that infrastructure has high multiplier effects on the economy. You invest R1 billion in infrastructure, according to the IMF, you get 2.7 billion rands into the economy, and you create jobs that have got, the jobs for the people, the profile of the people that we have in our country. So that is what happened. Our interest rates came down to 9.3%. We had GDP growth of 1.2%. So there was no GDP per capita growth over this period. Unemployment increased by 6.4 million people to 12.4 million in Q2 2024, and the unemployment rate increased to 42.6%. Now, the Ramaphosa presidency, the excuse is that we had the pandemic, but the economy, if those of you remember, was collapsing before the pandemic, and the recovery has been one of the slowest in the world. We had 0.5% a year from 2018 to 2023. What happened to the average emerging and developing countries? 155 countries, they grew by 3.7% a year, and 4.8% a year for emerging and developing Asia. 1.1% if we exclude the 2 years of lockdowns, compared with 4.2% for the emerging and developing economies, and 5.4% for emerging and developing Asia. So a consistent period is emerging here. Over 2 decades, emerging and developing countries managed to clear 4% growth without much effort. Why do we as South Africa find it impossible to achieve a similar? So in 2023, GDP per capita was lower than it was in 2007. It is projected to decline for another 3 years from 2024 to 2026. Now, what is going to happen to emerging and developing economies? The forecast, according to the IMF, they will grow by, again, 4%, 4.2% a year. Emerging and developing Asia will grow by 4.9% a year. Now, by 2026, we will have had 19 years of declining average living standards, and we can't continue like this. If we look at the Ramaphosa presidency, he was sold as a popular person, business-friendly, liked by white people. But look at what's happened. We have suffered 3 electoral disasters in 5 years, the ANC, 4.6 percentage point decline in 2019, 8.36 percentage point decline in 2021, 17 percentage points in 2024. 2 national election disasters accounted for 85% of the 25.72 percentage point losses over the past 15 years. Public investment has declined by 22%, and total investment has also declined. The number of unemployed people has increased by 3.2 million, and the unemployment rate has risen to 42% from 36.3%. Now, what we see here is that power blackouts, everywhere I go, I say the multiple Eskom plant breakdowns started in 2018, not 2007. And the collapse in Transnet operational performance started after 2018. Now, look at the energy shared according to political administration. Under President Cyril Ramaphosa, what I call the 6 years of darkness, 95.1% of the energy shared since 2007 happened during the 6 years of darkness. I'm saying this because, we just have to look at facts. So now we are an unviable society. We've got second highest unemployment rate in the world. We were the highest for a long time, but Eswatini last year, my second home, overtook us. And I couldn't believe this. I had to call people I was at school with, what's happening in Eswatini? And I had to go and look at their labor force survey. It's a very good labor force survey. And they indeed have a higher unemployment rate than South Africa. And by the way, I just have to say, unemployment in our SACU region, it's the highest in the world as well. Botswana, the members of SACU. So I believe we are exporting our messed up economic structure to the region. And also what happened is that World Bank had a report showing that we have the highest inequality rates in the region some years ago. So 70.6% for youth, 47% for Africans, 50.4% for African women, 54.2% in the Northwest, 1.1 million unemployed graduates. So the first thing we have to learn is that the skills mismatch theory of unemployment is a fantasy. If the problem was on the supply side, there will be millions of vacancies. Therefore, it is an insult to say that people are unemployable. The world unemployment rate, we have to compare ourselves against the world, is 5.1%. More than 80 countries, I counted on the ILO website, have achieved full employment, defined as an unemployment rate of less than 5% by myself. So there is no excuse for this unemployment rate that we have as a country. Now, how to create jobs? Stephanie Kelton, one of my favorite economists, she says capitalism runs on sales. In survey after survey, we find that the number one reason businesses are slow to hire and invest in new plant and equipment is the lack of demand for the things they produce. Businesses hire and invest when they're swamped with customers. Everything else is just noise. And then Keynes, the great economist, he says, you will never balance the budget through measures which reduce national income. The chancellor would be simply chasing his own tail. It is the burden of unemployment and the decline in the national income which are upsetting the budget. Look after unemployment and the budget will look after itself. So what are the drivers of this unemployment crisis? On the supply side, it is the labor force growth rate. So my scenarios, they forecast a labor force growth rate of 2.3%, slightly lower than the 5-year pre-pandemic growth rate average of 2.6%. So the labor force growth rate times the labor force, the people in the labor force, is the annual new entrance into the labor market. So according to this scenario, 740,000, with my work with Youth Capital, I've sliced this unemployment data every year for the past 30 years. 740,000 annual new entrants into the labor market until 2035. So on the demand side, GDP growth times the employment multiplier is the employment growth rate. Now, the employment multiplier is an observed historical relationship between GDP growth and employment, which I've looked at different periods over the past 30 years. So the second myth the first myth is the skills mismatch theory. The second myth is that there has never been jobless growth in South Africa. So when the economy grows by 1%, employment grows by 0.9%. So the employment growth rate times the number of people who are employed is the annual number of jobs created. So with a 1.5% GDP growth rate times a 0.9% employment multiplier, the employment growth rate will be 1.35%, which is lower than the labor force growth rate. So 240,000 jobs will be created each year with the status quo of 1.5% GDP growth. Yeah. And then that's the situation. Now, what are the labor market statistics post-GEAR? This is the period when we're growing fast. We created 3.1 million jobs. What you can see from this is that the sectors that created jobs were trade, construction, because of the infrastructure boom that was happening here, finance, financialization, community services, that's government. And the interesting here is that some people say there was a mining boom. But as Prof was reading earlier on, in a previous life, I was the person who did a lot of research on mining, and we did not benefit from that boom, and we lost 110,000 jobs in mining. So mining was the only sector that didn't create jobs during that boom. So now, the 15 years, if we look at the labor force, the supply side, the number of people in the labor force increased by 8.3 million, from 20.7 to 29 million. What is the demand side? We created 1.9 million jobs. So the difference between the labor force growth and the employment growth is the increase in the number of employed people, 6.4 million. The shocking statistic, the first shocking statistic, is that we only created 1.2 million jobs in 15 and a half years. That is absolutely shocking, yeah. Now, the second one that's also shocking is that if you see there, we created 1.9 million jobs, but youth employment collapsed by 800,000. So that means that during this 15-year period, we created 2.7 million jobs for older people above 35, and then the young people lost their jobs. So the employment multiplier for young people was less than zero. So now the strange thing is that during the earlier period that I talked about, from 2003 to 2008, I did the numbers, and exactly the same number of jobs were created of the 3.1 for older people and young people. So we're creating jobs for old people and young people at the same time. So what are the three levers to reduce the unemployment rate? We've already talked about one. It's GDP growth. And then the second one, obviously, is industrial policies to increase the multiplier from 0.9 to increase the labor intensity of GDP growth. The third one is public employment programs. We've got three public employment programs: the Presidential Employment Stimulus, the Expanded Public Works Program, and the Community Works Program. I've talked to the heads of all those three programs. I talk to them from time to time. So now, this is the situation we're in right now. It's a right-wing ANC-DA coalition. From 2009, the growth collapse and soaring unemployment coincide with a 25.72 percentage point plunge at the polls for the ANC. If the starting point was the need to change policy, there would have been a different outcome. ANC and the DA account for 87% of this coalition. Other parties are just irrelevant traffic. 77% would have been with the EFF. So basically, they've got a mutual veto on each other's policies, and the DA can effectively veto any policies that it doesn't like. So basically, the scenario is they will double down on the failed policies that were the cause of the collapse of the ANC's electoral support, which will be more contractionary. The 2025 budget will include a fiscal rule with a primary budget surplus target of 2% a year and a lower inflation target of 4.5% a year. At the time we need to loosen the screws, the ANC needs to maybe increase its electoral support. They're going to be cutting government spending. So it clearly tells me that the ANC is not interested in staying in power, because I can't imagine any other any other political party that would now. There's this propaganda, and I like this thing that Zorin Zimavave came with, the distinction between the fake economy and the real economy. Now, the fake economy is of the fake economy of financial markets. The people who support this government of neoliberal unity, they're coming with all these fake economy statistics to say that things will get better. It's based on what I call GNU vibes. It's not based on any substance. For example, the Argentina stock market has soared 70% since December 2023, when Javier Milei became president, but poverty levels soared to 53%, and the highest level in 2 decades. Financial markets are casinos that are not related to the real economy or jobs or food on the table. So the coalition coincided with a pivotal turning point in the world economy when it became clear that the US Fed would start a new cycle of cutting rates. And when the Fed cuts rates, the mighty dollar weakens and capital tends to flow to emerging markets. And the JSE has increased by 10.6%, but the MSCI emerging market index was 7.5% up. And you must remember, 80% of the assets of JSE companies have got nothing to do with the SA economy. I'll just give you one example. The largest company on the JSE is BHP Billiton, and that accounts for 20% of the JSE's market capitalization. It doesn't have a single mine in South Africa. The rand appreciated by 4.4% since June 14, when this coalition was announced, but the dollar has weakened, and that's what happens. And people must understand that a strong currency does not equal a strong economy. These two are not related. Bond yields have declined, but that is what happens when there's disinflation and also the Reserve Bank is expected to cut interest rates. So what is happening in the real economy? The number of unemployed people, this is what gets me worried, has increased by 118,000 during the first 6 months of the year. This is more than my forecast of 400,000. The economy has shed 71,000 jobs. This is worse than my forecast that we would create 150,000 jobs this year. The construction sector has shed 118,000 jobs, 4 consecutive quarters of declining investment, despite all the talk of politicians, investment summits, we want investment, and all that. It's 4 consecutive quarters of declining investment. 17 million people applied for the 370 Rand a month social relief of distress grant. It's a huge increase from previously. Now, there's this thing called Operation Vulindlela, and the government business partnership modeled 3.3% GDP growth and 1 million jobs by 2030. Now, you don't have to be an economist to say 1 million jobs by 2030. It makes no difference whatsoever within the context of 12.4 million unemployed people and a labor force that is growing by 700,000, more than 700,000 every year until 2030. What will 1 million jobs create? And when I looked at the modeling of this thing, those 1 million jobs will not be created. 28 billion rail investment, this is the assumption. 22 billion from Transnet. Sorry about this, switch the phone off. 6 billion from private sector in 2025. However, we've seen a 56% collapse in the registration of new embedded generation facilities at NERSA. This is probably because of the end of load shedding and also grid capacity constraints at Eskom. The Transnet annual report says it will spend 17 billion Rand on rail capital spending. And this report says they'll spend 22. So this is spending that was already going to happen. And it's a leap of faith to believe that there will be 6 billion private rail investment on a break-on rail network. In a previous life, I was an advisor to the Department of Transport more than 10 years ago. More than 10 years ago, we were talking at the Department of Transport about opening access to rail infrastructure. More than 10 years later, it hasn't happened. So why should it happen in this year? So basically, yeah, so anyway, so now this is a summary of the economic growth forecasts the latest one recently. And this is what the major forecasters are saying. Nedbank says 1.4% over the next 3 years. IMF says 1.2%. And the Reserve Bank, everybody, the average of these 11 forecasts says 1% this year, 1.7% next year, and 1.8% the following year. So what does that mean in practice for unemployment? So 1.5% GDP growth, if you use those forecasts, the average of those forecasts, it means that the labor force will increase by 3.5 million people. We will create 1.2 million jobs. The number of unemployed people will increase by 2.3 million. During the seventh administration, the unemployment rate will increase to 14.4 million and the unemployment rate to 44.6%. Now, what does it take for a country to be successful? And this is just a concise summary. You need a mobilizing vision and plan. All the countries that I've studied, they have this. China, Malaysia, Vision 2020 in Malaysia, Japan called it an income doubling plan. South Korea, which I read a lot, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Botswana. So the summary, it's the same for all of these countries. There's a 20-year vision. You double the size of the economy every decade. There are 5-year plans with annual targets. And each year you calibrate the tools of economic policy, macroeconomic policy to achieve the target. China does it so well. So this year, China was scared that they won't achieve their 5% GDP growth target. A month ago, they threw the kitchen sink at the problem. They announced monetary and fiscal stimulus to pick up the economy, for the last quarter of the year so that they achieve their 5% GDP growth rate target. So all these countries had annual GDP growth targets, that mobilized society to achieve towards one objective. Now, in South Africa, we have a situation where we had the NDP, which had a target of 5.4% growth until 2030. And they also had a target of 11 million jobs by 2030. But nobody is responsible for achieving those targets. Central bank only cares about inflation, and Treasury only cares about debt. You have to have state capacity to initiate growth and development. We might talk about that later. You need high rates of investment, 30% in most of these countries, minimum, to 50% in China, which is extreme. Because if you're in China, today, the first thing you notice is that there's excess infrastructure, and they've taken it too far. But anyways, that's the issue. But human development, education, health, and social security. Huge gains in education, countries like South Korea, and health as well. Industrial upgrading from agriculture to industry to services and to new productive forces. China is talking about high quality development, artificial intelligence now. But as you start off in agriculture and then you go to labor intensive manufacturers. China actually is a good example. They were trying to create jobs for the people. They started off with low tech, shoes, clothes that were flooding our countries in the early 2000s. And now they've moved up that value chain. They changed their model each time, and it was infrastructure. Now they said, we're not doing so much infrastructure. We're doing AI, green economy, and all of those. That's industrial upgrading. Macroeconomic policy tools, wider range of policy tools than Keynes. They use multiple tools, state control of finance, exchange rates, which were kept artificially weak in all these countries except Rwanda, the African ones, but the Asian ones kept the exchange rates artificially weak to support exports, capital controls, quotas, differential interest rates, one for consumption, one for production, one for exports. So you had different interest rates, multiple targets and objectives, growth, unemployment, development of sectors, and inflation. Inflation targeting, one target, one tool is primitive and not fit for purpose. Close coordination of monetary, fiscal, industrial policies, implications for the mandates and independence of central banks. So what do we need in South Africa? We need a Marshall Plan for South Africa. We must understand the scale of our overlapping crisis. I get amazed at people who make proposals that are at the level of projects. We don't have time for projects. We have to understand the scale of the overlapping crisis. You cannot aim a water piston at a blazing inferno of unemployment. 12.4 million people, that is growing by 700,000 every year. We need a GDP growth rate of 4% a year just to absorb the 740,000 new entrants into the labor force until 2035. We have to create 1.6 million jobs to achieve full employment by 2035. That is 19 million jobs between now and 2035. Either we want to solve the crisis or we don't. GDP growth alone is not enough. With this 6% growth, there will still be 5.9 million unemployed people by 2035. There is no single policy that will get us to full employment. We need multiple policies to address the multiple dimensions of this crisis. And by definition, the policy tools to confront the crisis must be very large and have an effect throughout the economy. Unemployment is a macroeconomic policy issue that we cannot address through projects. So these are the elements of the plan for full employment. I'll just go through them quickly without details, maybe in the questions you want to talk a bit more about them. So we have to obviously have a mobilizing vision and plan with 6% GDP growth target that is binding on National Treasury and the South African Reserve Bank. As Prof said early on, I've been part of this campaign for universal basic income. So I've modeled it phased in over 3 years at the 3 poverty lines. A job guarantee, we have to merge our public employment programs and create a quasi-public institution with civil society oversight and professional management with the capacity to create millions of jobs. Infrastructure spending has to increase to 10 to 15% of public spending, 10 to 15% of GDP, whatever it takes to get to 30% of GDP. Industrial policies, we have to increase our spending on industrial policies to improve that GDP, to improve that employment multiplier. And we have to spend, my main thing is about 1% of GDP on Black SMMEs. I also believe we have to have developmental targets for bank lending and non-bank financial institutions. We also believe in universal public services to supplement basic income and the job guarantee. I'm a big believer in free quality education and health, public electricity. You must take profit out of education, health, and electricity. That's my view. And subsidized, and water, by the way, subsidized mass housing and public transport, regional integration, balanced economic development in Southern Africa. International migration is primarily an economic issue, not a legal one. So quickly, obviously, we need a new macroeconomic policy framework that's got a minimum GDP growth rate that is binding on Treasury and the Reserve Bank. It's a non-negotiable target, is the first step in healing the trauma of our painful past. Without a binding target that will mobilize society, there is no future for our country, especially the youth. Everything we try to implement to address the crisis will fail. If we don't grow our economy at 6%, everything you do is just doomed to fail. Every year we postpone making the bold decisions that are required to achieve this target will result in rising unemployment and make the crisis work. So what does that mean practically? It means that you must spend into the economy the difference between the 1.5% target and the 6% growth rate. So if you blend consumption and infrastructure, there could be a multiplier of 1.5. So it means that next year we must put 200 billion rands into the economy. So you must use your macroeconomic, your fiscal policy tools, your monetary policy tools to pump 200 billion rands into the economy next year. So we need a developmental central bank that has got a triple mandate of GDP growth, employment, and inflation, and the use of far more policy tools than interest rate alone. The central bank can reduce the cost of government borrowing, and it can lean towards a competitive exchange rate that supports the diversification of our export basket and industrialization. Just quickly about the economics of the universal basic income. For me, when I started working on this at the start of the pandemic, I quickly realized that it's about the economy. As Bill Clinton said, it's about the economy, stupid. It's an economic stimulus, not a grant. Tessa Dooms puts it nicely. Do you think the people who receive basic income are going to put it under the mattress? No, they're going to spend it into their communities in Tembisa, in Khayelitsha, in Soweto. And Cardoso, Dante Cardoso, a Brazilian researcher, he did a modeling of the multiplier effects, the first in the world, of 42 countries, and find astonishing high social protection multipliers. Mexico, 7.4, Pakistan, 4.5, Brazil, 4.5. And he looked at some African countries, Malawi, I can't remember which one, other ones. And we're working with him at the Social Policy Initiative to develop a multiplier for the South African economy, which should be out in the by the end of November. If the primary objective is economic recovery, we must let it rip and provide the largest possible stimulus in the economy. I'll just quickly go through. So my modeling of universal basic income, it's given to adults 18 to 59 and children who get the child support grant. So it's 33 million beneficiaries, 18.7 million adults and 14 million children. It's phased in over 3 years at the 3 poverty lines. I think the last one, the top one is about 1,600. The bottom one is about 760, somewhere there. 70% uptake and a 1.5% stimulus. And we escalated the 2023 poverty lines by 5% a year. And this is just the summary of what it takes based on our assumptions. So the gross cost over 3 years, it's 798 in the first year, 1,200 in the second year, and 1,800 in the third year. So if you're the mother and you've got 3 children, you get 1 for yourself and 3 for your children. So it's 1.8 times 4, which is 7,200 rands. So assuming a 70% uptake, there'll be that government gets from this. There'll be a clawback from taxpayers who are above the income tax threshold. And we model the stimulus effect because it will grow the economy faster than it would have been the case without. I don't have the figures, but the economy grows by 5.2%, I think 5% a year during the period of implementation. So 96% of the money comes back to the government through VAT, the clawback from taxpayers, and the stimulus effect. So this thing has a self-financing element. And we're working with the Brazilian researcher to come up with a more precise number of the multiplier. So the job guarantee, after receiving basic income, most people will want a job. We must establish a quasi-public institution with professional management and civil society oversight. We must merge our 3 public employment program, the Jobs Fund, the National Youth Service, Public Employment Services within the Department of Labor, and Harambee. We must create a new institution that South Africa can be proud of. And this, we have to create a new governance system. The public sector, there's a trust deficit with the public sector now, but we can't give up on the public sector. So what I'm saying is that I talked to Gloria Sirobe. The Solidarity Fund was an innovation in institutions to respond to the COVID pandemic. And by all accounts, it did quite well. And I was asking, why can't we have a solidarity fund in each of the 9 provinces to be able to spend the money to take this project forward? But she told me that they'd closed the solidarity fund now. But I'm just saying we have to innovate in terms of the institutions that we set up. During the New Deal under Roosevelt, they set up alphabet agencies to spend the stimulus money. And there were many of these agencies, one for housing, one for jobs, one for infrastructure. And let us do that. And let us innovate, people who are more clever than me, to develop a governance framework. So these public employment programs, they have a budget of 17 billion. They create 1.8 million work opportunities and 900,000 full-time jobs. We must abolish the failed 7 billion rand employment tax incentive and invest in the new institution. It must get a capitalization from the UIF surplus. And we must, so now a job guarantee of 5,000 a month indexed to inflation provide the second dividend floor for private sector wages and lift millions of people out of poverty and precarious work. So the first dignity floor is universal basic income. The second one is the job guarantee. So this is just basically stats of, Prof, you can distribute this to people who are here. I won't go through the stats about the public employment program, but the key thing is that the budget is cutting spending on public employment. You might have heard the president on Monday say we're going to increase public employment. programs. We're going to massify them. He said so at the end of the ANC Lekgotla, but the Treasury, the reality is that they're cutting the spending on public employment. So I think we must all cry out against this insanity of cutting spending on public employment. We have to invest in infrastructure. Our infrastructure is a shocking 14% of GDP. The shortfall to achieve the NDP target is 400 billion rand a year for public infrastructure and 1 trillion for total infrastructure spending. So we have to increase it to 10 and 15%, as I said. We have to restore the health of the SOEs, eliminate Eskom and Transnet debt, and fund their developmental mandates. So this is basically about infrastructure. Industrial policy, number 5. I just want to go through this. Our spending on industrial policy is so small, it's 0.3% of GDP. There's inadequate Black SMME finance, CIFA 2.4 billion, and National Empowerment Fund 700 billion. The National Empowerment Fund has never been capitalized since inception in 2005. The bank exposure of their balance sheet to Black SMMEs a few years ago was 21 billion rand, or 0.54% of their assets of 6 trillion. So we're not dealing with normal risk aversion, which you find in every country in the world towards small businesses. We're dealing with racism or negative profiling of Black SMMEs because of race. So SME financing gap is 350 billion. We've got too little funding, too few policy tools to drive industrial policy. A developmental central bank can expand its policy tools to support industrial policy as part of the employment mandate. There's no reason they can't fund the CIFA, the National Empowerment Fund. There's no reason they can't do that here. So basically, these are proposals to increase spending on industrial policy. But the bottom line is that if they are successful, we've also failed to achieve racial transformation. 1.2% Black ownership on the JSE, December 2022, my research here. So with industrial policies, we can increase the multiplier to 1.1 from 0.9. We create 19.3 million jobs, according to my scenarios, 1.6 million per year. By 2035, there'll be 1.3 unemployed people and an employment rate of 3.5%. Universal public services, I won't really go through it, but national health insurance, I'm talking to the people in the Department of Health to try and understand what they're trying to achieve. But the Department of Health says that you can restructure existing spending to create a fairer health system. But I do think that we have to be honest to the South Africans that yes, we must restructure existing spending, from the private to the public. It's almost like you put it in the blender and create a better health system. But on top of that, we have to spend a lot more money. I just did some scenarios about doctor to patient ratios and nurse to patient ratios. We need 150,000 doctors and 300,000 nurses to meet OECD benchmarks. So it is a huge project. It is not a small project. The same with education. I just think that we can't postpone. We have to equalize our two basic education systems, learner education ratios and infrastructures. If we equalize the learner education ratios between the two systems and towards international, we need 400,000 educators, So we have to double basic education output and tertiary capacity. Tertiary participation, 22% in South Africa versus South Korea, 102%. Argentina, 99%, Chile, 92%. Now, 15% of 24 to 64 have tertiary in South Africa, versus these are the 3 most educated countries in the world, 61% in Canada, 51% in South Korea, 50% in the US, and I think Norway is the other most educated country. So I don't believe in half measures. You must either do something or you don't do it, Finally, regional integration. We must not be ahistorical. Borders have always been porous as per design of the apartheid and colonialism. Migration, according to Crush et al., was probably the single most important factor tying together all the various colonies and countries of the subcontinent into a single regional labor market. South Africa has a long history of intra-regional migration that dates back to the mid-19th century. Ruth First, for more than a century, Mozambique, Lesotho, and later Malawi were the largest labor-sending countries in the region. Ruth First writes how Mozambicans arrived in South Africa to work in the sugarcane fields in KwaZulu-Natal. Then they worked in the diamond fields in Kimberley and the gold fields in Gauteng. Now, by the beginning of the 20th century, 2/3 of miners in our country were from Mozambique. Yeah. So this is what Hugh Masekela was talking about in his song, his legendary song, Isitimela. He talked about a train that comes from Namibia, Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Angola, Mozambique, Lesotho, Botswana, from Swaziland, from all the hinterland of Southern and Central Africa. There was free movement of labor within SACU until their independence, and 57% of mine workers from the region in 1997. I've engaged with Statistics South Africa on the data for the past 2 years, including sitting down with the Statistician General. The only thing that has changed since 1994, despite everything that people say, is the collapse of the Zimbabwean economy. It's the #1 driver of international migration in the region over the past 20 years. From 1996 to 2001, nothing happened to our migration. But it increased since the collapse of the Zimbabwean economy. So international migration is a function of unbalanced economic development in a region. And the most beautiful explanation of what is happening with migration and a prophetic forecast of what would happen if we don't address this was in the Reconstruction and Development Program. If you have a copy, Prof, go and read it and see what they say about migration. The most important policy priority must be to achieve peace and security in our region and build a strong and balanced regional economy. Why do people not understand that wherever you are, the migrants are your neighbors? If you're in Kenya, there's instability in Somalia. If you go to Mombasa, there's many Somalians here. If it's Nigeria, it's Ghana and your neighbors. If it's the US, it's Mexico, and so on and so on. The census 2022 had 2.4 million international migrants, 3.9% of the population. I just have to say, since I've engaged this data and I wrote about this quite a lot, this figure is an underestimate, but even if it's an underestimate, let's say it's an underestimate by about 1/3. So we're talking about, I'm assuming it's about 5% of the population. That's what I'm assuming. But the proportions are correct. The proportions are the same whether you were in the previous census and the current census. So you can apply the proportions to whatever number you want to do. You come to the same situation. So 77% of our migrants are from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Lesotho, and Malawi. That's it. South Africa will benefit, Professor Zondi was telling me, the most from regional integration. He says, Duma, who will benefit the most from regional integration? Who will suffer the most from the lack of it? South Africa must lead and underwrite this process and invest 1.5% of GDP a year in regional integration with a focus on countries, our neighboring countries. We have to harmonize our macroeconomic policies to achieve 6% growth in Eswatini, in Botswana, in Namibia, and monitor these countries. We must do it together. We must mobilize resources for a rather bigger SADC budget. I looked at the budget of SADC. It's a joke. And I benchmarked it against the EU budget. So we must 1% of GDP, 50% from GDP contributions, the rest from regional levies and taxes. We can pool our foreign exchange reserves to establish a regional economic development fund. I hear them talking about this train that must go from Johannesburg, the high-speed train, to Limpopo, to Zimbabwe. We must integrate our region. We must integrate our region through transport and infrastructure. Yeah, so we can pool our analysis of our foreign exchange reserves. We have to restructure this. I won't go into the technical details of our SACU revenue sharing formula, but if we restructure it according to a different formula, we create 40 billion rands. We create a regional development fund, and we upgrade SACU to a common market with free movement of labor And I believe we must invite Zimbabwe and Mozambique and top up this fund. We must have an aid budget for various humanitarian economic development causes. Just lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about the financing, because this is I've done so much work on the financing. I now found this one to be the least interesting part of it. But because I'm not a populist, I must actually say something about financing. Number one, the central bank money creation to support public spending. The SARB can't be independent of national goals. I'll repeat that again and again. How can you have an unaccountable SARB, unelected officials that are independent of the national goal? It makes no sense. It has no precedence in all those Asian countries that achieved, they made the transition from debt poverty towards newly industrialized country in one generation. Read the story, choose one country and just follow it. South Korea, and they achieved it in 30 years. The central bank can't be independent of national goals. That is absolute nonsense here. You can have central bank lending directly on favorable terms. You can have quantitative easing and yield targeting, where you purchase existing government bonds on the secondary market for an extended period to determine the government cost of borrowing. Now, I'll talk about this. PIC has got assets of about 2.8 trillion. Directly, it can lend directly or on favorable terms. So we can lend money to each other within the family before we go outside to Standard Bank, Old Mutual, or even to the IMF. Increased borrowing with yield targeting, where you control the cost of things. Higher taxes, but not on the majority of South Africans, on the top. And, the excess financial flows that we have in our country. We've got this deep financial market. So I would say, let us take from the top and let's do these financial flow. The level of financialization in South Africa is insane. So let's tax that, restructuring the SA Inc. balance sheet, a developmental financial sector. A monetary sovereign country that prints its own currency, borrows in its own currency, and does not promise to convert its currency into something can run out, such as gold, as they're doing in Zimbabwe, or another currency, cannot be broke or run out of money. Zimbabwe can't be broke if they can be broke because they fix. I'm going to Zimbabwe in 2 weeks' time at the end of the month, I argue with them all the time that all these, you fix against the dollar, you're going to run out of dollars. Then they say, no, we must fix against the rand. I said, but how much trade do you have in South Africa? You're going to run out of rands, and there'll be queues at the ATMs. It makes no sense whatsoever, but I don't understand why they don't understand. So central banks, for most of the 20th century, central banks were agents of economic development. They financed governments and wars from the First World War, intervening in bond markets to reduce the cost of government borrowing, managing exchange rate to manipulate them to boost our exports, and shaping the allocation of private capital. After a pause during the neoliberal era in the 80s, central banks started purchasing large amounts of government debt in the secondary market and limited monetary financing after the global financial crisis and the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. But during the pandemic, central banks pivoted to large-scale direct monetary financing, the issuance of public money to support government spending. They purchased 75% of all the new debt issued in 2020. The stimulus packages globally were about 17 trillion. They nationalized bond markets, according to the Financial Times. So the separation of monetary and fiscal policy was an artificial construct that has come to an end. So a developmental central bank can finance government spending, reduce the cost of government borrowing, capitalize development finance institutions, and use regulatory levers, including quotas, to influence the allocation of private capital. So this is like the central bank purchase. I just won't go into this. This is the central bank purchases of government debt in the euro. So in the US, 4.9 trillion stimulus, the central bank financed 48%. In the UK, 315 billion pound stimulus, the central bank financed 97%. In the euro area, 1.1 trillion stimulus, and the ECB financed 83% of that. So monetary financing and inflation, there's nothing inherently inflationary in monetary financing. Most central banks have done it for more than a century. Every country has an internal speed limit regulated by the availability of real resources, real productive resources. If the government tries to spend too much into an economy that is already at full speed, inflation will accelerate. MMT distinguishes between the real limits and the delusional and unnecessarily imposed constraints. Increases in the money supply, according to Epstein, are not typically themselves the causes of hyperinflation. MMT advocates correctly claim that most hyperinflations are due to profound structural disruptions in economies, such as famines or wars or gross management of the supply side of the economy, not the demand side. There's virtually no evidence that increases the money supply or debt monetization in the context of a well-functioning supply side of the economy is likely to lead to hyperinflation. Zimbabwe was not a demand issue. In the wake of Bill Mitchell says, there was a 60 to 70% collapse in production. They trashed the supply side in the wake of the land reform process. Any spending would have been inflationary. A government can't just reduce its spending by 70% from one year to the next. Agricultural in Zimbabwe is an agricultural country. Agricultural production went down by 80%. So to the argument, a lazy reading of South African economic history that monetary financing automatically results in an inflationary surge, Stats SA surveys have shown in recent years that large industrial companies have excess supply of more than 20%, primarily due to insufficient demand for the things they can produce. There's too little money chasing too many goods, so an inflationary surge owing to excess demand is impossible. There can be institutional constraints on the power to create public money. The UK had a parliamentary approval process informed by an analysis of the country's economic productive capacity, so what I'm trying to say is that, so the last one is restructuring the balance sheet. In 2016, an economist called Niva Makgetla from TIPS, she brought attention to this UIF surplus that was then more than 100 billion rand. She says, why don't we just use this surplus to stimulate the economy? Because the economy was already in a bad situation. So in COVID, I also participate in NEDLAC discussions. Treasury couldn't come with a reason why we should have this surplus. They created 60 billion rand out of thin air to pay 14 million people who were temporarily unemployed. That was the biggest portion of our post-COVID stimulus. It was money created out of thin air. If you look at the latest budget, we still have in that kitty 110 billion. There was no need for that surplus before COVID. There's no need for the surplus now. So from 2011 to 2023, 2012, the past 13 years, 11 years, I haven't looked at the latest annual report. The Government Employees Pension Fund accumulated surpluses of almost 600 billion rand, 53 billion rand a year. There is no need for the surplus. The funding is 110%. It's 400 billion rand above the target. So I'm saying, let's restructure this SA Inc. balance sheet. Let's put some of this money into the economy. And these are some of the details as to how it can work. The PIC already has government debt of about 800 billion rands, So let's restructure the balance sheet. That's what all our families do when we're in trouble. We restructure this balance sheet. And, South Africans are behaving like this has never happened. In the March budget, they created this facility, 150 billion rands. Now, because of the reserves. So I talked to the governor. They didn't touch the reserves. They created money out of thin air, 150 billion rands through that Jefekra. I don't know how to pronounce it. That's what they did. In the wake of COVID, there was the biggest outflow of capital in emerging markets in history. And the Reserve Bank intervened on our bond market and brought down the cost of capital. That was 40 billion rands. UIF surplus, we spent it. We're already doing these things. I don't see why we can't do these things. And then I won't even go into this one. The idea that our debt is high by international standards is absurd. It was absurd in 1996 and it's absurd now. So there's no reason why we can't do that. And obviously we have these deep financial markets in South Africa. It's unprecedented in developing countries to see such depths of financial markets. JSE of 19 trillion, bond market of 4.5 trillion, 23.5 trillion. We have to put this to use somewhere. That's what they do. We need a developmental financial sector. We have to have a debate about this. I was presenting this at the Old Mutual Conference, there's a name for this thing in Sun City, the guys who do these, the union investment companies. I can't remember. I was presenting to them about a month ago. And so we have to create a developmental financial sector. This is the last slide. And we need a compact with the financial sector. We need to create a new fund. I talked to the economist, Chris Madikane, a lot of, and it's a new asset class and a new mandatory, an inflation-linked zero-coupon bond. So, Tina, we don't want to tell the truth to the primary financial sector. We must offer this new instrument. It's how can I put it? It's an inflation-linked bond. So you as the institution, you'll only get inflation, nothing more. And then we can create a new fund. It should be almost like a new fund of about 1 trillion rands over 7 years to be invested in infrastructure. But there must be a clear separation of what is government and what is private. We can't allow the financial sector to financialize everything. So we must say, this is what you can't do, and this is what you can do. So we must decide through a political process. This debate around prescribed assets, it's because the government doesn't want to lead and say, you must have a board of what is acceptable prescribed assets. It could be gap housing, it could be taxi recap, it could be, I'm a big believer that the housing situation we have to sort out, the government can take over. Those are some of the issues, but this is something beyond. And we could set up a new public-private community institution that has civil society oversight and professional management to evaluate projects on technical criteria and award contracts to qualifying projects. So these are some of the institutions we must set to get South Africans to again believe in this public sector. We could do one for the developmental financial sector because people will eventually agree to it, what I'm saying, but they'll say, Duma, not this ANC government. That, like when I was doing mining, I brought this concept of a sovereign wealth fund. People and the nationalization of the banks. I remember I was talking to, this is my last comment, the CEO of Coke. He's an American guy called Doug. He says, well, I believe when you say so, but not when Julius says so. But what I'm trying to say, and then other people say, yeah, we agree with you, but not this government. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you so much. If you can just close the slide from your side, the screen. Thank you so much. Wonderful. Sure. Ladies and gentlemen, you can just see the passion from the man. He's been doing this over the years, as I said, some of us, we know him. And then we've got talent in South Africa.
Yeah, the funny one is that I didn't even talk about BE, my favorite topic, and the fake statistics.
I know.
It's a separate one. Yeah.
I know that Prof Zita definitely will be asking you to come back and will be requesting to come back. And I'm saying this in advance because I see that there's so much that we still need to grapple with and then discuss. But I don't want to waste any time, ladies and gentlemen. I just want to open this time now to engage with Duma. I do hope that Dr. Cleopas Sibanda is here with us in the light of his presentation last week. I don't know if Doc would like to, if I can just give you this open start with you. Any observation, especially in the area of social security and protection? We had a wonderful presentation from you last week. Any brief observation, and then after that, I'll ask my sister Kim Hela just to say a few things. Then anyone, ladies and gentlemen, you can just raise your hand, and then let's engage Duma. Dr.
Yes,
Sibanda, are you still here with us? Any
I'm
thoughts? Go ahead,
I'm
my
around,
brother.
bro.
Yes.
I am around. I've been around. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yeah, go ahead, sir. Yeah, thank you, sir.
Yes, thank you very much. In fact, I'm very happy to be here and listen to Duma to corroborate some of the things that I was talking about last week, especially to do with the social security and social protection. One of the things that I wanted to say, which maybe did not very much come out in Duma's presentation, is that I believe the economy does not only grow, should not only be seen to be growing through GDP or with inflation or with other stuff that they are called economic indicators. I have always advocated that the best economic indicator is what happens at individual level, at individual family unit level. The economy must grow in people's pockets, in people's bank accounts, in people's homes. And the economy must be shown to be growing by the rate at which people are able to afford and access their basic human or daily needs. And the basic human and daily needs, like I talked about last week when we talked about it, we start with food, we talk about shelter, we talk about education, health, transport, communication, safety, and security. And I'm glad that in his Duma's conversation, he talked about some of those things, because these are the things that when they improve in terms of availability, accessibility, and affordability, the people will feel and see that their economy is growing. And this can only be done through social security and social protection. I like him talking about certain excess funds needing to be invested. And in where I come from, we usually go down to the basics and talk to the real things on the ground that needs to be done. And I like it that he actually talked about some of these things. There should be, for example, as far as food is concerned, we should have what we call a National Agricultural Development and Food Security Fund. This is a social security fund which should be in operation and running regardless of who comes in government and who goes out. This fund would ensure food production and accessibility to food, availability to food, and availability of food to all people. No one should go and sleep on an empty stomach. I was seeing some nutrition statistics in some malnourished children in South Africa today on television, and I was like, wow, we have undernourished and stunted kids even in South Africa. I thought it was only in Ethiopia and South Sudan and other countries, and that is not good, because now it's not about there is no food in South Africa. One of the commentators was like, no, it's not like there is no food. People cannot access it because they don't have the money. And when you have got a National Food Security and Agricultural Development Fund under social protection, and you follow social protection rules, you will actually get it. One of the things that Duma talked about, which I would like to give as far as social protection and social security is concerned, is that when you have got social security fund, there is something what we call the 30-30-30-10 rule. That 30-30-30-10 rule, or 30-30-10 rule, says that 30% of annual premiums of social security and social protection funds must be used to pay benefits. The other 30%, not more than 30%, must be used for the administration cost of those funds. And the other 30% must be invested in solid asset projects, which is partly like infrastructure development and other things, to actually augment the fund, obviate its need in future, and make it self-sustaining. And the other 10% must be held in reserves. He talked about many reserves there. So that applies to all social security funds. And I can tell you a whole lot of social security funds. I started with the Agricultural Development and Food Security Fund. That is for food. National Housing Development Fund for housing development. It must be there under social security, and it will do exactly what Duma was talking about. And there is National Health Insurance Fund, which will provide quality health services and standards and the health infrastructure and everything in place. as he was talking about with that 30-30-10 rule. Then there is National Education Insurance Fund, which will provide free basic education from kindergarten to university. And the Nordic countries have done that. Then there is the National Transport Fund for accessibility to transport, communication. Of course, safety and security are state functions, but still they can also be secured. What is good with social security and social protection is that all these funds are not going to be run directly from the government fiscal budget or administered by government, as I talked last time. They will be administered by independent boards as independent parastatals. Of course, government is a stakeholder in all of them, but it doesn't have the final say. And those funds are not going to change the way they operate just because Cyril Ramaphosa has come into power and has gone out of power. Like the yellowing of these figures that you've been talking about, that in the beginning when there was Thabo Mbeki, things grew like this. When Jacob Zuma came, now this, we can't have our economy going up and down and yo-yoing up and down just because of who is the face of politics. So we need, like they've done in Europe, in the developed world, they've protected social security and the social protection systems by ensuring that they are immune or immunized from changes in the political arena in terms of who is leading, who is not leading. Those institutions are solidly built, concrete, and in place ad infinitum, and they do their job, they do their work, including the central bank. He talks about it must be a national issue, a national bank in terms of its outlook with national agendas, like he said. And the national bank is actually part of one, the central bank is one of the big social security funds which should be there because it must provide social protection. And social protection means that, okay, thank you very much.
To want to complete that talk, that we can pick up Kim, then I'll ask Duma to respond.
I was just saying that the central bank, according to Social Security, is part of a social security institution, which must ensure that in times when people in the country cannot be able to help themselves, they are actually helped to meet their basic human and daily needs. It must not be a business institution to fleece off people. And I agree with Duma very much in terms of the outlook of the social bank. This is wrong, and it must be defined. And when we talk of social security, I agree with him because the central bank is one of those social security financial institutions like these social security funds I'm talking about. So it must, we need to do that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, my brother. Thank you very much. Thank you. Duma, if you don't mind, let's take Kim Hela, then you can just respond to them. Then we'll take another round of questions. Sis Kim?
Hi, good evening. Professor, first of all, thank you for these wonderful forums, and you've brought one of my absolute favorites onto this platform. I'd hope that my comment in the comment section was sufficient. You know, I always say, here is our future finance minister and one of the most astute people. Anyway, I thought that would have covered me, but I would like to ask our future finance minister 2 questions. The first is, how many years does he believe it's going to take South Africa to recover from the GNU and the supersizing of white politics on our national political body? And secondly, I would love his perspective on the continent in general, where we see African leaders going in very different directions. Some are very much in pursuit of the politics and finances of their former colonial masters, but we do see a trend of leaders that are exploring very different options. So I would love his expert opinion on that. And thank you so much. It's an honor to speak on a platform like this.
Thank you. Over to you, Duma.
Thank you so much. In reverse order, Kim, thank you for the kind comments. You know, just before the Kenyan, you know, the marches in Kenya, like 3 weeks before, a friend of mine came from the Eastern Cape, a Kenyan friend of mine, and I took him around Joburg, and he was fuming about Ruto. And, you know, he just said, this man won't last, you know. And jiggy, next thing, Kenya's up in flames. Yes. So Kenya, Nigeria, Egypt, you know, these are, you know, one friend once told me, you know, there's certain countries that must work in Africa. And he says it has to be South Africa in the south, Kenya, Nigeria in the west, and I think it was Egypt in the north, you know. We have to get those countries growing, because what's happening now is that South Africa's lack of development, it's bringing down the whole region. So I've seen certain reports that say Africa's growth with and without South Africa. That gives you an indication of, how badly we're doing. So yes, we have to get the whole country. But what I was saying is that let's start in our neighborhood. Let's bottom up in terms of economic development, in regional integration. And yeah, that's what. And then Kim, this GNU, people know me that I've stayed away from politics, many times. And, since this thing, GNU, I've been glued on the politics, and we're seeing one breakaway from the Communist Party. We can call it a breakaway. I live by Bedford View, and many of the communists, in our local mall, I talk to them regularly. And we are seeing a rebellion. So, what happens is that when you're opposed to the GNU, like me, on purely economic reasons, they say, no, you're EFF or MK. But then the people who are coming to me every day to talk about this is ANC members. So we've seen one breakaway from the SA Communist Party. There is a low-key rebellion happening with Panyaza Lesufi, not my favorite person. I get the vibe that he's kind of running rings around, Luthuli House, and he's doing basically what Zuma was doing. And you deny until something happens, And yeah, so I don't think it's going to last the full 5 years. In fact, I predicted this in my column that we're going to see ANC-DA coalition, I think 2 years ago in Business Day, and I've written about it a few times. Mandela's one lasted 2 years under different circumstances. This one's, and the biggest risk is from within the ANC itself, what happens, and there's this fake unity that they're creating, and I don't think it's going to last. In fact, I'm prepared to put it's not going to last 5 years here. Something's going to break somewhere. Dr. Sibanda, as you were talking about GDP in the pocket, I first heard it, I was at a conference in Dar es Salaam, and one of the ministers from Tanzania said there must be GDP in the pocket, And one of the most influential books that I've read in recent times, in fact, there's two of them, yeah. In fact, if you want a reading list, these are if you want a reading list, like 3 books together, it's The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton, number 1. Number 2 is Less is More by Jason Hickel, where he talks about, the things that Dr. Sibanda was talking about. Jason Hickel subsequently grew up in Eswatini, and he talks about degrowth from a deep understanding of global South issues. And then there's also the one by Kate Raworth about the donut economics. If you are not versed in these things, have those 3 books in your library. But the key thing that you're saying is that I operate sometimes in mainstream circles, and I tend to get misunderstood that the focus, GDP growth is an outcome of all the things that Doctor is talking about. When you invest in your people, the economy grows, and so it should be seen, I agree with you 100%, as an outcome. And all the things you're talking about, I was particularly interested in the issue of food, and maybe we can take that up later. Yeah, we can take up the issue of food. Housing, I talked about very briefly because of time. The national health insurance, there's a statistics that's used in terms of national health insurance that 85% public and 15% private, which is your medical aids. But if you look at the medical aids, only 22% of the people on medical aids have comprehensive cover. And the majority have partial cover or hospital plans. And when they run out of during the year, they go and use the public sector. I had a friend of mine's mother, they had to go to to Charlotte Maxeke now. It's end of the year, and yeah. So I would like to find out. So the actual number is 3.3% of the population has got comprehensive medical cover through the system that we have. The rest of the 15%, which is 11.7, they are zigzagging between public hospitals and private hospitals, depending on the situation. And I agree with you. So what I liked about what you're saying, and also what Kim was saying, what I can't understand, Prof, is that there's so many people who've got so many amazing ideas in this country. And they used to talk about skills shortages. That is absolute nonsense. There's so many intelligent people in this country. If we put our mind to it, I've got a friend called Chief Lediga. He says he's to the right of me, but he says, if you had to leave us in a room, we'd agree on certain things, Do you see what I'm saying? But what I find, the leaders are so cut off from the day-to-day. If you listen to the discussions, I was listening to an interview that Paul Mashatile had with the Financial Times. He was saying, we don't have money, so we must privatize everything. Now, that is absolutely absurd. I mean, what quality of discussions do they have on a daily basis on that NEC? Ordinary South Africans are having much more quality discussions about the problems that we're facing in this country. Yeah. So I just don't understand it. And we've got, so all the things that you're talking about, the National Transport Fund, the taxis, when I was at the Department of Transport, they're buying at 20, the interest rates at transaction capital are 27%. It's absolutely insane. We can't have a situation like that. So we have to provide subsidized finance to those taxis to make the industry more viable. We have to regularize the entire industry from start to finish. We must we must formalize the entire transport sector, the taxi sector, because a lot of the crime comes from that sector. And so I just think we must formalize that sector completely, from routes to scheduled transport routes, to subsidies, to cost of finance. And so Dr. Sibanda's got the solutions, and we must talk about these things. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think we'd really love to see one day when we can bring together these great minds that we find here in this platform, and then put something together that will really move forward. Because we always say that we don't want just to be a talk show, talk, but we want to also provide suggestions and solutions and then proposals that can take this forward. Because I know most of the government colleagues, they always criticize us that the problem with academics that they talk a lot among themselves. They talk all these things, and they criticize, especially as well analysts, they criticize like a lot, but they don't assist in providing solutions. Let me take my brother there. I see a hand from Dr. Chumamangisa. Over to you, Doc.
Yes, no, thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. Majola. And thanks to Ubabu Duma Gqubule. The insights, of course, they are so great. It was as if you could continue to speak endlessly. I don't know whether perhaps until the cows come home, if there would be cows not stolen by whoever. I'm not going to mention names. I am looking first at the topic that says vision 2035. And I'm asking myself then, Babu Duma, are you saying once we achieve this vision in 2035, we don't have to worry anymore. Things will go as we would like them to go, because we would have arrived where we're supposed to be in as far as, you know, employment is concerned.
I think Doc,
Doc,
sorry, Doc Mangisa, sorry, man. I think
yes?
if we can achieve this, probably not once, unless he takes over himself, as Kim said, that maybe becomes Minister of Finance himself. But I think it's here's the proposal. If we can do this, this is what will happen.
Yes, definitely. You are correct. You are correct, Prof. You are correct. Unless then, as economists would say, that growth is cyclical. Economic growth is cyclical. At some point in time, it will dip. Maybe we are saying, come 2035, things will be fine. But at some point in time, it will dip again. And the reason why I'm saying this, it is because from a cathedral thinking point of view, shouldn't we be saying we should be creating jobs, or we should be growing the economy, even creating jobs for those that we are not going to see for the future, you know, generations to come, rather than us saying, you know, 2035, 2045, and so forth. It must just be, you know, perpetual, you know, that we grow this economy for the next generations to come. And we don't put, you know, sort of a destiny that come this, you know, yeah, we would have arrived. The next question is your views, your opinions on the two-pot system vis-a-vis economic growth within the country. I am told now that in as far as SARS is concerned, it has benefited more than 2 billion rand from the withdrawals, you know, that, our fellow public servants have withdrawn from GEPF. Does that suggest, you know, growth in our economy? Does that suggest sustainability in as far as economic growth is concerned? And perhaps lastly, I must say I am happy, you know, that you are saying this facade that the unemployability, it is because of lack of quality skills, lack of the scarce skills within the economy. Because one famous person says, every Sunday, you go to Sunday Times, they are advertising jobs. City Press, they are advertising jobs. And this famous person was saying it is because we don't have the skills that this economy needs. And we are saying, you know, that relationship for you, it seems to be, you know, something far-fetched. Otherwise, Mr. Gqubule, thanks very much, you know, for enlightening us and capacitating us. Thank you, Prof.
Go ahead, Mr. Gqubule. Go ahead, my brother.
Well, thank you so much, Gqika. It was just something to, you know, like all these countries have a vision to, to focus the mind towards an achieved objective. It's a 10-year, it's a 20-year vision, it's a 10-year vision. And this vision, because it was assuming that you would start implementing this year. So by the end of the year, I have to adjust the numbers to Vision 2036, you know, and it's a whole new. So if you look at China, they set up. I think the growth wasn't cyclical. If you read those countries, there were dips, but how can I put it? It wasn't cyclical. Like as I was saying, if you see this year, they see they're not going to meet that growth target. They put the kitchen sink at the problem. They throw the kitchen sink at the problem. The current problem is rising youth unemployment. They've got a target of 12 million jobs, you know, urban jobs. And every time, you know, the world economy dips, they change towards the domestic economy. And what people don't understand about China is that the model was changing throughout the development of throughout the history. So if you look at the last 20 years, they started off with the low-tech manufacturers, and they were exporting the excess capacity to us, you know, the clothes, the shoes, the textiles, and whatever. And then as they moved up, upgrading, they went on to the infrastructure. And then now they've moved to what they call high quality development, your AI. So you might be at full employment, but there are many more issues that you need to have about the quality of the employment, because of the 80 countries that I said have full employment, not all of them have got quality jobs, you know. So you have to be, it's a treadmill that doesn't stop. You have to be increasing that all the time. Yeah. And you're right, it's for future generation. And the cathedral thinking, I first heard it from Eric Mafuna, when we were talking about the current problems of the BMF, which me and Prof are, you know, we're not happy with the situation of the BMF currently. You know, I was trying to understand what's happening, and he was telling me about cathedral thinking, you know. But yeah, that's correct. So I understand. In terms of the two-pot system, let me just say the short version is that Nedbank says that the Lemali, it's too little too late in the year to make a difference. The Reserve Bank scenario, which I thought was the more realistic one, it's not going to increase. It's not going to increase much in terms of GDP, 0.1 percentage point this year and 0.3 percentage point next year. So it's not going to have a much impact on the economy. But the assumption that I thought most of the debates on the two-pot was, are people going to use it for debt, to pay off their debts or spending? And I came to the conclusion most of people are going to spend it into the economy. But this is because the allowed withdrawals were also limited, you know. I think government could have struck a better balance between providing relief to workers and ensuring pension preservation. I think there should have been a higher weighting to the objective of providing relief to workers. I think the savings pot could have been increased to 25%. I think they should have waived the tax on the once-off transfer, and they could have reduced the tax rates for recurring withdrawals to the same for retirement. So I made a number of, I said like, yeah, so it's very interesting because the government, the bribe was so little for you to get pension preservation. I think it could have been a bit more. So I think they could have had a better balance between providing real relief to the people, because if that was also, and achieving pension preservation, that is my view on the two-pot system. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Duma, it's, you know, as you are presenting, I don't know whether one becomes sad or very troubled, because it seems to me we really need very bold leadership to turn around things. You need a maverick, a heterodox leader, you know, who will just come. And I like our sources, Nomkita is saying the call. She always talk about the benevolent dictatorship of Rwanda. That really, we are talking about Rwanda. It's Rwanda now. There are some criticism in terms of how it's, the system is there, but that benevolent dictatorship has worked. And I think in South Africa, I'm very troubled, man, when I look at our leadership, as you presented here, to say we're in serious trouble, because I wonder if do we have someone, not that we don't have, we've got great leaders in South Africa. We always say this, and then we have unleashed so many in this platform, many great leaders. But I wonder in terms of the system that is used by ANC, that really are we able to turn things around? I don't know, what is your thought? Then I'll take Dr. Gqubule there after you come.
Yeah, so now if you read about South Korea and you listen about General Park, you'd say he was just a madman, you know. He was so obsessed in terms of this development. I think he was there for 23 years. He completely transformed that country in 23 years. I think it was 23 years. I can't remember the number. And then I had the privilege of going to the NEPAD Heads of State implementation meeting in Addis. And I was watching Umelez, you know, and I read a lot about him, what he was trying to do in Ethiopia. And obviously they got certain things wrong in the country. No one's perfect, you know. But he used to say, we're pursuing the South Korean model with Ethiopian characteristics. Because obviously the countries are very different, but he says we're pursuing. So, and then if you go to South Korea, I mean, if you go to China, they went to study Japan, they went to study South Korea, and they came and implemented with Chinese characteristics, you know. So you can borrow, you know, people like benchmarking against other countries, you know. You can benchmark and benchmark and benchmark, but after some time, it doesn't matter. You know, you must do what is appropriate for your country. That's why, and you know, not we can take this benchmarking too far, but it needs a certain level of insanity, I do think, you know. And, you know, as you correctly say, these are not normal people, these leaders, you know. And when you read about Roosevelt, you know, within the American context, you know, he was a hated person, you know, by the business people. And he caved into the business bullies in 1937 and implemented austerity. And then the war rescued him. But he wasn't listening to them. He was swearing at them throughout the beginning of the New Deal, you know. And yeah, so we need those people. You know, in the UK, they had a debt of 250% of GDP. And what do they do after that? They implement the National Health Service. They implement all the welfare state. And what happens? The debt to GDP goes down by 7 percentage points every year, because they're investing in their people. And it goes down to about, I think it went down to about 50%, you know, over the next couple of decades, you know, because they were making those investments in their people. And, you know, so I agree with you. You need a certain, you know, like I think whether we will make as South Africans the sacrifice of democracy and economic progress, I don't know. It remains to be seen, yeah. But most South Africans, yeah, if I have to, I think they probably would make the sacrifice. Yeah.
Thanks, my brother. Thanks. Actually, yesterday somewhere I was speaking and I was explaining, as we were talking about the former President Roosevelt, that he's the one actually who introduced this concept of 100 days when he took over in 1933 in the midst of Great Depression. He took over in March, and then in June, he had completed that 100 days. And then in July, he made that speech that in 100 days, this is what I've achieved. And then after that, that is why now everyone is just talking about what's your 100 days? Give us what have you done 100 days? That's where it comes from that man, because of what he did during those crises. Thank my brother. Let me take Dr. Gqubule Mfuya. He will be the last one. After him, I'll ask Duma to respond, but also to give us his parting shots. And then after that, I'll request my Professor Zide, to thank the speaker. Dr. Gqubule, over to you.
Of course, Prof, and I hope I'm audible. And And I'm very I like this topic very much. Duma knows that when we speak about it in BMF, I'm always passionate about how do we grow our economy. I wanted him to just mention or try to explain to me, when you speak about this industrialization, doesn't he think that the changing of curriculum or the way our TVET colleges are now structured has had a negative impact in terms of how our industrialization go about? Because if you can see now, the output of at vocational level at TVET college is very low. They are now focusing on things like accounting, public management, business administration, etc., instead of them producing your welders, your boiler makers, etc. Because if you speak about industrialization, you must have the skill set to speak to that. Not all of us must have these PhD, whatever skills that we need. We need to have people that can produce. But if we can't have agricultural colleges producing those farmers also, it also becomes a problem. So what is his thinking that we ought to tailor make our TVET or vocational training to what the industry needs? And then I also want to ask him, what is he thinking in terms of the issue of exploring import substitute and making sure that we're only buying outside what we can't produce locally? We are seeing currently that the influx of the Chinese products that are very difficult to compete with because of their economies of scale and other things. What is this thing that we should be protecting our infant industries to make sure that we localize, we protect, we use legislation? If it's not effective, we are meant to make sure that we are able to advance our local economy. Thanks, and I enjoyed the discussions. Thanks, Prof.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Biggs. I'm just looking for something. Yeah. So I looked at the whole issue of TVET when I was doing some work for Youth Capital. Of the 1.1 million unemployed graduates, 261,000 of them are graduates from universities. And then there's a category called other tertiary, which is 790,000. By the way, you won't see these statistics in the labor force survey. After each release, I ask StatSA to give me additional statistics because I don't ever use the official definition. So I asked a lazy there called Desiree and to give me additional statistics, and I'm forever thankful to that. And so what you see is that the unemployment rate for other tertiary, which is your what you call it, your TVETs, is 27.7%. And for university graduates, it's 12%. You've seen, as you correctly said, and in the report, I can't remember Tindatini and Zakfonela and maybe is that the enrollment has been collapsing in recent years because of, and then there's a funding crisis. And my father was once on one of these TVET schools at Inacha. Basically, the quality of these schools is just a disgrace, the TVET colleges. And my thing is that we probably have to start that thing from scratch again, completely, yeah. And it needs people like you, Dr. Biggs, to redesign that TVET system. I think the system is not working at all. I think employers, I don't know, it's just a disaster, and I think the parents and the learners are realizing that this is not an education, and I think we have to strike a balance between academic and non-academic education, and I don't know, I don't know what the solution is there, but it is a big problem. Yeah. Import substitution. Hey, I'm old school on this one, the biggest driver of import substitution, I think what South Korea did, South Africans and their oil price and their petrol price, they're going to kill me. you must use many tools for import substitution. But the biggest driver, is when this, how can I put it, when the currency becomes weaker, and it's something I haven't talked about, because people just get scared about it. But South Korea had a massive devaluation twice in the 60s that laid the, it helped them, because once you can't pay for that Apple laptop that you're using, and once it's unaffordable, industry will find alternatives, and yeah, so and there's many other policy tools that they used, tariffs, quotas, which we should be using as well as a country, to develop local industries. Yeah. And just back to what Dr. Subandra said in the beginning, what was it about? It was about basic goods. Yeah. No, I've just forgotten what he said, but there's something that's related to that he was talking about. But yeah, so yeah. So I do think that you must use many policy tools, not just one, because we've been talking about this proudly. South Africa was set up in 2001, but what has it achieved? What do we buy that is local? Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Duma. Thank you very much. May I invite Professor Zide just to thank the speaker, and then we'll close the session after that. My professor, over to you.
Okay, good evening, my professor, and good evening, everybody. Am I audible, my professor? Thank you so much. Let me first start off by sketching a background about Duma. He may not know, but perhaps he knows that I once worked with his father very closely. Indeed, his father was the president of the Methodist Church at some stage, and also became the Grand Chancellor of Seth Mukitimi Methodist Seminary at a time when I was the chairperson of the governing council of the seminary. And so, Duma, I know, when I know your father, it means that you are my son. Never mind the age. But nonetheless, thank you so much, Duma, for such a very instructive presentation. I think you have combined three things in your presentation. What I call the mathematics of economy, as well as the economy and financial management 101. I mean, those who know the modules, we're coming from the old school of courses, course 1 and course 2, course 3 and all of that. But with the introduction of the new system, we're talking about modules. And so you have really presented three modules: mathematics of economy, and financial management 1. And as you were presenting, I looked at the scenarios which you presented, and I said to myself, Duma is in a way reminding us, or some of us, about that song which was sung by Jimmy Cliff. The song was, "Too many people are suffering and too many people have got nothing. We will remake the world." And particularly the last part of it, "we will remake the world." I see in you somebody who will be able to contribute more substantially into remaking South Africa. I mean, Kim Heller spoke about, we're looking at the new Minister of Finance. And I'm saying, maybe we're looking at the new Governor General of the Reserve Bank. But because this is basically what I think Omsai, which is your father, would have said. And I'm saying that. I want also to say, as Prof. Majola was asking, what kind of a leader do we really need to take us out of this morass? And he quoted my sister there, Nomkita Mona, when in one of our presentations said, perhaps South Africa needs a benevolent dictator, and cited, of course, the issue of what is this, Rwanda, Paul Kagame. I mean, if you go to Rwanda today, nobody is thinking about the Hutus and the Tutsis. They are all together. And Paul Kagame did a wonderful job. I mean, you spoke, Duma, about the issue of benchmarking. You would often meet, our ministers and senior administrators. No, we're going to Japan. We're going to China for the benchmarking. But come back and what else do you see? Absolutely nothing. But I think your presentation touched on so many things that we can do. When you spoke about developing the financial sector, I think that for all of us who are participating in this leadership development conversation, you should really bear in mind that in our small corners, indeed, we have to ensure, even if government listens or does not listen, as we will probably do, but the issue of developing financial sector, that's very critical. And you spoke about economic policy, the regional integration, infrastructural development, the employment, putting emphasis on the growth of employment, looking further. But currently, I think the situation is very dire. But of course, the improvement of health, education, and of course, you referred to the collapse of the Zimbabwe economy and restructuring. I think that those issues, for me, Prof. Majola indicated that I will probably say you must come back. I think it's a whole package which probably has not done justice to these 2 hours. Maybe in one of our summer sessions, we will have to ask you to come back for a Saturday afternoon, face to face, so that we can have this engagement and get more enlightenment and have these questions, on a face-to-face basis. But other than that, Duma, thank you very much for the presentation. And when I go to the Eastern Cape, I will certainly go via your home. I know it's still there, even if it's in the new hands, and convey my regards, to Omsai and Mama as they are there. But anyway, thank you so much, Prof, for this opportunity. I think there are many people I see. My friends here, Advocate Sizani is also here, and Obet is here, and many other colleagues. So, colleagues, thank you ever so much for participating, as well as the questions that were posed. I think they were very enlightening evening to you, Duma. And so, thank you once again, Duma. Thanks. Bye-bye, Prof. Thanks for the time.
Thank you. Thanks, my professor. Indeed, I really do agree that probably we do need Duma in one of our seminars or workshops. I know that we have had so many seminars with him before, especially he didn't even touch the area of what is it, BE issue, and that is the area that does a lot of work on it. So hopefully he's a very busy person, but God willing, that we'll find him maybe a time where he can come and address us in a seminar, so that we get more time to engage more. So thank you so much indeed, my brother Duma, for availing yourself to share your insights. Thanks a lot. Ladies and gentlemen, to those who joined us for the first time, I did say when I opened the session that we meet every Wednesdays at 6 p.m. Please do join us again next week, Wednesday. We meet every week. Can you imagine every week you eat this kind of food? Because what we guarantee is that there's no way you'll attend our session and you don't learn anything from it. You will be learning. There are always super master classes, and then you learn. That is why every Wednesday we've got such a caliber, not only of our speakers, but of our participants there who come here. I always say the people who just in this call, when you look at them, very, very senior people coming from all sorts of spheres of life, just to come, listen to each other and to engage with each other. So thank you very much. The session is adjourned now until next week, Wednesday. May God bless you and goodbye. We'll see you again next week, Wednesday. Thank you. Goodbye.